Hey everybody, and welcome to Kevin Kraut YouTube channel. I'm going to do week 3 of the college football season. I didn't do week 1. All I've done is week 2 because I completely forgot about week 1. You have Ohio Bobcats versus Louisiana Lafayette Raging Cajuns. I'm going to go with Ohio Bobcats. Then you have UCF Knights versus the Louisville Cardinals. Going with Louisville. Then you have Maryland Terrapins versus Illinois Fighting Illinois. I'm going to go with Illinois on that one. Then you have Southeast Missouri State versus Red Hawks versus Missouri Tigers. I'm going with Missouri Tigers on this one. Then you have Cincinnati Bearcats versus the Indiana Hoosiers. I'm going with Indiana Hoosiers. Connecticut versus Army. I'm going with Army on this one. Most of these are at 12 o'clock. New Mexico versus Texas A&M. Going with Texas A&M. Virginia Tech versus West Virginia. Going with West Virginia on this one. Albany Great versus Syracuse. I'm going with Syracuse. Northern Illinois versus Michigan. I'm going with Michigan. Western Michigan versus Pittsburgh. I'm going with Pittsburgh on this one. Nebraska versus Oklahoma. I'm going with Oklahoma. I'm sorry that people like Nebraska, but I'm going with Oklahoma on this one, because they're a team that's supposed to be joining the SEC. Then you have Coastal Carolina versus Buffalo Bulls. I'm going with Coastal Carolina. This could be a hard game for Coastal, but I think they pull through. They're a fighting team, and they could possibly be facing Gamecocks in the bowl game if Gamecocks go to a bowl game next year. Michigan State versus Miami Hurricanes. I'm going with Miami Hurricanes. Boston College versus Temple. I'm going with Boston College. Chattanooga versus Kentucky. I'm going with Kentucky. Tennessee Tech Golden Eagles versus Tennessee Volunteers. I'm going with Tennessee Volunteers. They had that impressive win against Nebraska. Arkansas. Minnesota versus Colorado. I'm going with Colorado. Eastern Michigan versus Massachusetts. I'm going with Massachusetts. Nevada Wolfpack versus Kansas State. I'm going with Kansas State. Jordy Nelson's school. Purdue Boilermakers versus Notre Dame. I'm going with Notre Dame. Notre Dame has themselves a good fight on their hands against Wisconsin, but I think they'll probably beat Wisconsin. I don't know. That's 2 weeks from now. Delaware Fighting Blue Hens versus Rutgers. Going with Rutgers. Kent State versus Iowa Hawks. I'm going with Iowa Hawks. Baylor Bears versus Kansas. Kansas just recently got knocked off by Coastal Carolina. I'm going with Baylor Bears. Florida State versus Wake Forest. I'm going with Florida State. Bryant University Bulldogs versus Akron Zips. I'm going with, I don't know anything about these two teams. I guess I'll go with Bryant University Bulldogs. Idaho Vandals versus Oregon State Beavers. They're both 1-1. I guess Oregon State on this one. USC Trojans versus Washington State Cougars. I guess Washington State. Tulsa Golden Hurricane versus Ohio State Buckeyes. They have been playing very bad lately. But I think Ohio State bounces back. Ohio State on this one. Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets versus Clemson Tigers. Clemson Tigers won their first game finally after getting beat by Georgia the first game. I think Clemson wins this one. Then you have LIU Sharks versus Miami Hawks, Red Hawks. Ohio? Is that? Neither one has won a game. Let's go with the Sharks. And you have Elon Phoenix versus Appalachian State. Appalachian State on this one. Alabama versus Florida Gators. I'm going to go with Alabama on this one. It might be a close game, but Alabama has the strength on this one. SMU Mustangs versus Louisiana Tech Bulldogs. I'm going to go with SMU. Mississippi State Bulldogs versus Mississippi Tigers. Memphis Tigers. I'm going Mississippi State. Ball State versus Miami Cowboys. Going with Miami. Sacramento State Hornets versus California Golden Bears. They haven't won a game. California. Let's go with California Golden Bears this time. They win their first game. Colorado State versus Toledo. Let's go with Toledo. Okay, Georgia Southern versus Arkansas Razorbacks. Arkansas has won 2 games. I guess I'll go with Arkansas. Northwestern versus Duke. I'll go with Duke. Arkansas State versus Washington. Go with Washington. Murray State versus Bowling Green Falcons. I guess Murray State on this one. East Carolina, they lost to South Carolina last weekend. They're 0-2 now. Marshall Thunderbird. We'll go with Marshall on this one. Middle Tennessee versus UTSA Roadrunners. I guess the Roadrunners. Old Dominion versus Liberty. I'm going with Liberty. Fordham Rams versus Florida Atlantic Owls. Going with Florida Atlantic Owls. Florida A&M versus South Florida. I'm going with South Florida. Let's see. Now the later games. Well, those 2 other ones were late. South Carolina versus Georgia Bulldogs. This one could be an interesting game here. South Carolina versus Georgia. I'm going to go back to that one. I'm going to read the rest of them. There ain't too many left. Grambling State Tigers versus Houston Cougars. Going with Houston. Charlotte 49ers versus Georgia State Panthers. I'm going with Charlotte 49ers. Troy Trojan versus Southern Miss. I'm going with Troy. Florida International versus Texas Tech. I'm going with Texas Tech. Utah versus San Diego. I'm going with San Diego. And you have Incarnate Word Cardinals. Texas State. I'm going with Texas State. Auburn Tigers versus Penn State. Going with Auburn Tigers. Stony Brook versus Oregon Ducks. I'm going with Oregon Ducks. Furman versus NC State. I'm going with NC's. Well, I'm changing my mind. I'm going to go with Furman on this one. Central Michigan versus LSU. I'm going with LSU. Utah State Aggies versus Air Force. I'm going with good old Air Force. Virginia Cavaliers versus North Carolina. I'm going with that North Carolina. UAB versus North Texas Mean Green. Going with UAB. South Carolina State Bulldogs versus New Mexico State Aggies. Both have lost. They're both bad. They have not won a game. I'm gonna go with New Mexico. Alcorn State Braves versus South Alabama. I'm going with South Alabama. Stanford Cardinal versus Vanderbilt. I'm going with Vanderbilt on this one. Rice versus Texas Longhorns. They lost pretty bad against Arkansas. But I'm going to go with Texas Longhorns on this one. Tulane versus Ole Miss. I'm going with Ole Miss. Jackson State versus Louisiana Monroe Warhawks. I'm going with Jackson State. Oklahoma versus Boise State. I'm going with Boise State. Northern Arizona Lumberjacks versus Arizona. Going with Arizona. Arizona State versus BYU. I'm going with Arizona State. Iowa State versus UNLV Rebels. I'm going with Iowa State. Fresno State Bulldogs versus UCLA. Going with UCLA. San Jose State versus Hawaii. I'm going with Hawaii. And let's go back to the South Carolina versus Georgia game. Now this one, of course I'm a Gamecock fan. Yes, through and through, Gamecock fan. This game could come down to two things, or three things. South Carolina has to stay in the game the whole entire time, or they lose. They have to make turnovers, because this can be a tough team for South Carolina. They barely beat ECU. They barely beat them by a field goal. Yes, they barely beat them. Bulldogs are usually hard to beat. Georgia is usually hard to beat. I'm going to go with Georgia on this one, but it doesn't mean that South Carolina cannot win this one. They're favored to win, Georgia is, by like 33 points.